Okay, so I guess it's already started, but I have no idea what window can you see. So it will be really great to hear somebody just on the chat telling me whether it's visible or not. Okay, I'm muted. Okay, maybe now. I cannot do much more regarding it. Okay, so somebody can actually hear me. Okay, so okay, so I guess somebody's problem. Okay, if you want to follow me on slides, here's the link. Okay, let's just give people some minutes, a minute or two. 13 participants, okay. It's really great to actually see the list of attendees and actually see that the whole company is here. And even some friendly people are here. Okay, let's maybe wait a minute or two more because we're still waiting for some people. Okay, Jan is here, so I guess that's some information that we can actually maybe start. Okay, so hello, welcome to my presentation on uniforms. I guess some of you are in here because you heard yesterday from Maciek how great this package is and how important it is in our company, I'd say. Maybe not that important, but quite crucial in our open source portfolio, let's say. Anyway, let's start. I have already pasted this link to the presentation on the chat, so you can follow with me all the slides. And if you want, the screen I'm sharing right now should be enough. Okay, so let's start. So today I'll be talking about uniforms, and the uniforms are all about schemas. So if you have a schema, then you have a form, and that's the goal of today's talk. And what I wanted to start with is something that I was actually asked for. So let's say something about me, but I'm not really a good talker about myself. So let's just write me in 3 points. So at first, I'm a software architect in Glasgow. At second point, I'm working with Meteor for 5 years right now. And I think it's a great piece of software to work with, especially if you are working on multiple projects. It's a really good baseline to actually base your projects on. And then I really like tea. I have one right now, so let's just proceed. And if you want to hear more about my boring life or just want to hear more about me, here's a link. You can go there, check out my stuff. There's a lot of my open source stuff, some of my thoughts, things I'm doing in the internet. Okay, so let's move on to the uniforms. So the first question I'd like to answer is that why actually we build uniforms, right? Because many software companies are making some software libraries because they need them, right? But there's always a deeper reason for that. So in our case, uniforms are here because there were no autoform from Aldit for React. And we as a company switched to React quite strongly. And by strongly, I mean we switched almost all of our projects at once. It was kind of gradually, but it was kind of it was too good not to take this opportunity and just migrate all the projects to React. And that's basically it, right? So there were no other choices at the beginning. So we wanted to start with React in multiple projects, and the only way to actually have forms in React was to either do them manually, and back in React 0.14 or 0.11, it was a terrible work to do, especially with the value links, if you know what it is. It's kind of part of the React history right now. So we started working on something like that, and I think we really managed to do it. We even have a logo that is kind of important for me, and I think that's really a good sign that we already developed it so much and we really believe in the software that we actually named it. We have a logo for that. We have a community built around that, and that's really great. So the base idea of uniforms is the schema, right? But with time, we saw that there are multiple schemas and multiple UIs libraries. So what we wanted to have was to have something like, we want to use every kind of schema with every kind of theme. So for example, I'm using a simple schema, or then I'm using the simple schema from NPM, which is a little bit different, or I'm using JSON schema or GraphQL schema. And then on the front end, I have Bootstrap or Bootstrap 4 or Semantic UI or Material UI or ND or whatever. There's a ton of possibilities in here. And we didn't want to build a new library each time we were changing the schema, so the backend logic, or changing the UI on the front end, right? Because those two should be decoupled. And our goal was to actually build the library in a way that it will be possible to use it within your own schemas and if your own teams. It's not something I'll be talking about today. I just wanted to say it loud that it is possible to make your own schema adapters, or as we call them, the bridges. And it's possible to make your own themes. And a theme is basically just a set of React components that you can make. And maybe let us brag a little bit about the numbers. So these are not really up to date, but I think they kind of reflect the scale we are talking about. So uniforms up to, let's say, this date had 51 contributors. Actually, there were more, but I'm not really counting Travis or GitHub bot into it. 152 released versions on NPM. Not all the packages have 152 versions, because, for example, the bridges were developed later. They were actually added in Uniforms version 2, so they have fewer versions. But Uniforms core in total has 152 versions. Over 400,000 downloads of the Uniforms package alone, right? So only this core package was downloaded so many times. And if we sum all of the packages that we have, it's almost 1.2 million, and I'm pretty sure it's over 1.2 million across the old packages at once. And if we are talking about maturity, I think it's already kind of old because it's over 4.5 years. So it's quite a long time to work with something, to see a piece of software actually evolving with time, evolving with multiple projects that we worked on, evolving with multiple use cases, multiple UI themes that we developed, with multiple business logic edge cases that we had to deal with. So I think it's already battle tested and then actually quite mature. So maybe let's start with some demo to actually show you how uniforms work and how you can actually use them in a basic, very, very basic way. So let's take it step by step. So the first step is to have a schema, right? Because as we said, schema is everything. And if you have a schema, then you have a form. So in this example, I'm going to use simple schema, which is the simple schema from Aldit, but not the old Meteor version. Uniforms can actually work with the old Meteor version, but the newer simple schema version from NPM. And here we just define a simple schema, right? So we have some title, we have some author, we have some copies, and some date. Basically, the point in here is that every kind of schema you can define using simple schema. So every type of field you can have. So strings, number, objects, dates, lists, arrays, whatever, it all just works. Everything is handled out of the box. So we define such a schema. And now what do we have to do with that? So the second step would be to create an adapter or so-called bridge to uniforms. So we just have to import the bridge constructor, import our schema, and then create a bridge. It's simple as that. It may seem redundant, but it's important in simple schema because it's important for uniforms. For example, when we'll see how it works with GraphQL schemas or with JSON schemas, then we'll see that it's actually a little bit more complex in those cases because simple schema provides not only the schema definition, but also provides a complete schema validator. So that's our bridge, and let's move on. So that's all. We can already make the form. And the form is actually a single component. So in this example, we import the AutoForm component from uniforms dash 3 question marks, where the question marks are your theme. Currently, we support undesigned, Bootstrap 3, Bootstrap 4, Material UI, Semantic UI, and an unstyled HTML theme. Then we import our bridge that we just made in the previous step, prepare some on-submit logic, which in this case is just a API call that actually saves the model that we receive. And across all the slides and across the whole uniforms library, name model means the object that you are actually working on in the form, right? So let's say that this schema was a book schema. So in here, our model will be the book object itself. And simply using the AutoForm component. So we are using the AutoForm component, passing it the bridge that we created, a non-submit function, and that's all. It just works. But it's not a really good demo to just see the code and see how it works, right? So let's see how it looks like. If we use uniforms UND, so the undesigned version, the form looks something like that. But if we use uniform semantic or unstyled or Bootstrap 3 or Material or Bootstrap 4, it looks different, right? And that's exactly the spirit of the library. We are using the same schema without adjusting a single line in there, the same bridge, which is only the logic that we are using in there. And then the only thing that changed is the UI theme, the React component actually, right? And that's the important part for us because we really want to keep the UI and logic completely separate, completely decoupled, because in many cases, the logic that we are actually using in the forms is not really that important, right? Because there's far more business logic on the backend when we actually submit the data to the server, and then the server says, okay, the data is valid, but for some reason, this data makes no sense, right? So the form on the client side is fully valid, and the client side schema validation is fulfilled, everything works. But then the form itself should have some additional library for the validation logic, and that's not in the picture, right? The React component shouldn't even think about something like server logic or validation, or what does it mean for a field to be required, right? So that's something what we have out of the box. And while we are talking about the features, I'd like to pinpoint, I think, the most important ones in our case. And not important ones as in those features are the killer features that we have and others don't have. But the killer features that we have that actually makes uniforms such a base library. So the first feature I would like to talk about is the custom fields. And by custom fields, I mean creating components that works with uniforms and can be used in your themes. So at first, we import the connect field helper from uniforms, create our React component, and as said in the footer, everything that has the onChange and value props will work, right? So we receive the value from the model. In this case, we assume that the value is a number, and then tell using the onChange that the value has changed. and just export a component using connect field, right? So our rating component is our simple, normal React component that you can actually use in other places outside of your forms, outside of uniforms. But using connect field, you created a uniforms field, which is automatically wired up to the uniforms context. And if you're using it without inside the uniforms form, it will automatically hear about the value hear about the newest value or whether it changed, and can actually automatically use the onChange prop. Um, but that's kind of old school because right now we have version 3 coming on, and the version 3 is a little bit different. So in version 3, instead of using connect field helper, we are using hooks for that. So we developed something called use field hook, which is basically the same, but the goal was to not only not create a new component in between those components that we already have, but also make it composable. Because in this case, you can have a single component that actually works like a multiple, that actually works for multiple fields at once. So for example, this field could, if we'd like to do something like a date range field, we can have two fields, so the minimum and maximum of the range at once. But it's fully opt-in, you can still use connect field. Okay. And then about the layouting. So we thought that at the beginning, we thought that maybe it would be really great to be able to fill all our schema and all of our layout desires in the schema. And while it is possible, in many, many cases, it's not really easy to work with, right? Because let's imagine that we have our form and then our client says, okay, but those fields should have some like section label or some title above the field, or we just want to group those fields in certain groups, or we want to display them vertically or horizontally, or we want to, I don't know, put them into an accordion, right? There are many, many ways to actually work with the forms. So what we'd like to do is to be able to fully customize the layout by ourselves. So how we can do it? So the bare minimum is actually the same as with the basic layout that we had in the demo, in the third step. So we import the autoform component, we import the bridge, we define some onSubmit function, and we create the autoform component, right, in line 10. And that's the basics. Then what we can do with that is actually we can customize the insights of the form. So for example, we can import the autofield component, which is a small field wrapper that bases on the schema properties, for example, the value type, and then automatically detects which kind of component you'd like to use within this field. In our case, name is a string value, so it will use the text field component. On the other hand, we can explicitly select which component we'd like to render, right? So we can, for example, prepare a name field in the schema, and then we'd like to explicitly tell it that we'd like to use text field for it, or num field for age, if it's a number. And what is also important is that if we define a custom field, for example, using connect field or using use field hook, that's exactly how it works. It has no difference between a custom component and a component that is actually made in the theme, because the theme that we are actually providing in the uniforms, for example, uniforms and D package, are exactly built in this way, right? So they are just straight React components that were made using connect field. And that's our custom layout. But there's definitely more. For example, as I said before, there are more schemas, right? Outside of the Meteor world, outside of the simple schema world, there are things like GraphQL. And there are some cases where you may actually use GraphQL schemas on the front end to actually build your forms. There are such use cases. So how does it look like from our perspective? So the first thing is that you'd have to import the GraphQL schema bridge. It's just the same as the simple schema bridge. Then you have to have your GraphQL schema. In this case, I assume that your bundler or your building library or just Meteor handles the GraphQL import. I I don't remember the name right now, but there's definitely a Meteor package that actually automatically translates GraphQL schema, and using an import from .graphql file, you'll just get the GraphQL AST in hand, right? So the schema variable is just GraphQL AST. And it works with GraphQL, again, fully out of the box. So in this case, we have the address type, which has two fields. Both of them are strings, but the city is required. And then we have the customer type, which is a little bit more complex because secret is a float, so it's just a number, it's not a problem. But then the address is a reference to the address type, right? So in here, we actually made a type which has a subtype. So in simple schema world, we just created a schema that has a subschema, right? So it's slightly more complicated. And then, as I said, in the simple schema case, the simple schema provides a validator for each schema you'll define, right? And that's great because that just works out of the box. But in the GraphQL case, we have the schema, and the schema defines things like field name, field type, or if the field is required. But the GraphQL schema does not tell us the things like, let's say, title has to be at least 4 characters long, or the street has to be different than the address, than the city, sorry, right? All of your validation should happen in here. Of course, you can use a custom logic for that. You can use, for example, UP library for that, or even simple schema if you want, but you have to build the validator by yourself. Then what we can do more, we can provide additional props for the components. For example, we can specify the label or styles or just additional props for the React components in here. And again, in the simple schema case, it's not really needed because in simple schema, we can just extend the field definition of the schema, right? But in GraphQL case, the field definition is just a string in the GraphQL code. And then we create the bridge itself. So we get the type from the GraphQL, which is the GraphQL AST node. We get the validator and the options, and that's the bridge that we can actually use inside our AutoForm component. And that's basically it, right? So again, in this case, we can exchange the whole business logic of the form without touching the React components at all, right? Because what we did in here is to define some GraphQL code, then define the validator ourselves, and the validator, again, can be decoupled from the GraphQL schema itself, define extra React props, and then use the bridge as it was every other bridge. Okay, and going further, there's also JSON schema, and it's the last feature that I want you to remember, because I think that's the most important one. Because in our cases, even with Meteor or with NPM normal node projects, in every single case, we saw that the JSON schema is really superior. It's it may get extremely complex. It's extremely easy to use. And the biggest selling point of that is that it just works. And it's just JSON. So it's serializable. You can just send it to the server, send it to the client, I don't know, mutate it, save it in the database. It's really great to use. So let's maybe see how it works. So at first, we have to import the bridge by ourselves, then import our schema. And in this case, the schema itself is just a JSON object, right? So we have it in a separate file. We have the schema object, and that's a really basic JSON schema. So what it does, it defines an object with property name, which is a string, property experience, which is a integer, so a number without the floating point, but it's at least 0 and at most 100. And then the name is a required property, right? What do we do next? Is that we have to prepare the validator by ourselves. So in all of our examples, and it's scattered all over our documentation, and we also do the same in our projects, we're using AJV. So AJV is a JSON schema validator library So how it works is that you create an AJV library instance, and then just for the purpose of this demo, we just create a create validator helper that takes a JSON schema object, so the schema object that we see on the right side, and creates a validator that is actually compatible with the uniforms validation, right? And in here, we just create the bridge instance using our schema and our just freshly made validator. And again, in this case, we are using AJV to automatically generate validator from the schema. But you can not only use AJV, you can use different libraries. You can even write the validator by yourself. Or what we kind of often do, you can use the AJV, but extend it with, for example, custom keywords for the JSON schema. I won't get more into detail in here, but you can just read about the AJV in general. It's a really, really great library. And I think that's kind of all for the code itself. I don't want to bother you with many, many sites of the code in here. You can just go to our documentation or just read about it on our website. But let's maybe talk about something that I think is really important when it comes to open source and when it comes to developing libraries as a company, right? Because just to recall you, this whole library is maintained and baked by Vasco. And the core of the software logic in here is that every company, in a way, is focused on actually earning money, right? So why software companies develop such things? So that's something I'd like to talk about a little. So we are actually developing it fully in open source, right? So the uniforms are 100 open source, made by Vasco and developed by Vasco Open Source Group. Uh, it's not actually a technical name because this group don't really have a name. Maybe that's a problem. Maybe you should have a very formal name and we should have maybe some mascot of a kind. But the goal of this is that we have a public GitHub project. You can go there, you can see all of our Kanban board. We have weekly meetings. We are working on open source and being paid for the company, by the company, sorry, right? So the point in here is that we are building the open source and the company pays for that. So in case of like you are being afraid that maybe this library will die next week, or I won't, let's say, the author of this, so the maintainers of this package won't be there in a month or in a year. No, there's a company behind that, and we have a lot of projects based on this library. So we are really putting our thought into it, and we are really standing behind it kind of strong. What is more, the library itself is growing organically, fully organically. And what does it mean is that we are dogfooding everything we write. If you ever requested a feature request on this library, maybe you saw that we were kind of, let's say, restrictive when it comes to adding new features. And that's mostly because we are not really into developing something that we don't think makes sense in the library. We really encourage you to create new libraries or new tools on top of uniforms. We are really into that. If you have something like that, let us know. We can help you maybe getting more traction on that. But the point is that we already made so many projects and so many different edge cases in so many different technologies, so many different businesses or even business branches, that we believe that in a way we already saw everything when it comes to the forms. So if we think that something makes sense, we'll definitely do it. But if we think that it only makes sense if you do this one-liner in your project, you can just do it in your project. It's also 100 need driven. So we never actually implemented anything in uniforms if we didn't saw a need for that in an actual project of ourselves or of our customers or of the people that are actually in the community of uniforms. So in most cases, it's like, okay, I think it may be useful to maybe have this one more flag in the library. But then it turns out that nobody's going to use that because you can just do it a little bit differently, right? So we don't want to have that. We don't want to bloat the package with unnecessary code that is there because you'd like to have something in there because it may be useful in a year. And I think that's most important in this year because it's getting kind of dark. It's getting kind of weird during those last times, and there's whole pandemic. It's really important to work on things that you actually like to work on. So in this case, no one was hurt nor forced during development, really. So I'm kind of laughing in here, but it's like we are developing this library because we believe in it. We as a developers, we as a company really believe in this library. We really believe that it brings value, not only to our company, not only to our like open source group, but also to your projects if you are going to use that. One more point about being production ready or not. So as I checked, because it was really kind of hard to pin down, the first public version was released on 10th May of 2016. So yeah, kind of a long time ago. But the first deployed version that went live was 8 days before that. And it's possible because we were just developing it in one of our projects and it was just in there. So after we developed the package in the project, we were actually developing it for kind of, I think, 2 or 3 months maybe. It got released, and then we said, okay, it's ready. Now let's just extract it, pack it, and release it to npm. And what I also said is that this package is evolving, right? Because if something is on the market for so long, like 4 years, it really has to change. Because, for example, we change, our projects change, but also JavaScript changed. For example, uniforms are strictly TypeScript centric right now. Libraries, like our dependent libraries like React, for example, changed a lot during this time. So the first version was in 2016. Second version was released in 2019. And what is, I think, the most important in here is that migration from version 1 to version 2 required you to install 1 or 2 more packages, actually 1 more package to be exact, and then change 1 or 2 imports, right? So you are not the only one that are actually using those packages that every single week force you to rework the whole projects of yours, right? We don't want that. We also have projects by ourselves, and we really don't want to invest that much time to update every single project of ours every single time a new version is released. That's why we don't do that. And that's why we are trying to make the version 3, which is due soon, so easy to migrate and so great that it won't require any migrations anymore for a long, long time. And maybe just some links to all the things around. So we have a website at uniforms.tools, which is, I think, it's not only a documentation, it's also a little bit about our knowledge about our like unique selling points, about our features. There's also documentation. There are tutorials in there. There's also a playground if you'd like to go in and just like live code your schema and see how the form would look like. We also have a Gitter. So if you want to chat with us, you can just use Gitter for that. Our repository link, of course, and then our open source project. And if you'd like to get in touch, either go to Gitter, just write us in there, or file a new issue, or, I don't know, mail us or something, whatever. And I think that's it. So if you have any questions, please do write them in the chat, in the meeting, or just ask them in polls if you have any. And I'll just give you maybe 5 minutes. And if we're done, I think that's it. Has anyone made a file upload component for uniforms? Yeah, I think I even made 4 myself. Yeah, but I think there's one open source that actually was integrated with the Austria Slingshot. I think there was a presentation regarding it yesterday. I'm not really sure whether it's maintained or not, but it shouldn't be a problem that much. Because if you'd like to do something like a file upload, you can just use your file uploading library of choice. And then as soon as you get the link from the library, just call on change with it. And then the link will be stored in your model. Any plans for the uniforms for the future? Yeah, so as I said, version 3 is still in works. Right now, we migrated, I think, 4 projects in total to version 3, and we are migrating 2 more, and there are more things popping up about it. But as soon as we migrate most of our bigger projects, we can be sure that it just works for you. And if you need to migrate your library, your project, it will be an ease for you as well. Then it will be released. And what is next? Well, you can go to issues or to our board and see what's on our board, what is planned for version 3.1 or 3.x, so later time. Can a TypeScript interface be considered a schema, perhaps? Well, yes and no. So TypeScript interfaces can be used for schemas, but they have the same problem as GraphQL schemas. So they define the shape and they define the fields, for example, but they won't define the validation logic itself. That's one part. So you'd have to write the validator by yourself. And the other part is that TypeScript types are erased on runtime, right? So what you'd have to do is to have some kind of a tool, maybe some library or some transformation that would actually take the TypeScript file and rarefy the types into a runtime objects that can actually be used and read by uniforms to generate your schema. Version 3 has been working great for my projects. That's great to hear. Matthew, here's an example of the docs, how to create image upload field. Thank you, Maciek, for that. How does it compare with other popular React form frameworks? So I think part of the answer is already in the question. This is not a React form framework. This is a React form library, and that was our goal. So if you'd like to see some comparison, I can even show it, I guess. There is a little bit of a comparison on our website. I don't want to generate a password right now. Comparison matrix. So we can read through it. But basically the core idea is that in many cases, uniforms are best suited for work with automatically generated forms. And in other cases, it's not really a big difference. If you are going to make all your forms manually designed using the custom layout, then I think it doesn't make sense to really put more thinking into it. Just choose whatever works for you. But when it comes to things like some of my forms are automatically generated and the rest is, let's say, manually customized, then you can use uniforms to unify the logic across your app. There's comparison metrics. Okay, thank you, Wojciech, for that. Got it, nice. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I think we can just wrap it up, or maybe there's something in the pools section. Nothing. Okay, so I think that's all. And thank you. And that's it. And